So good afternoon, and thank you very much for joining us on. Actually, good morning, and thank you very much for joining us on this Friday. So this is part of a series that Out Leadership is holding, and I wanted to take a minute to thank our global sponsors, which are HSBC, Ropes and Gray, RBC Capital Markets, EY, and KPMG. So in this series, we hosted 2 months ago Frédéric Martel, who had written a book on the closet of the Vatican, which was the role that same-sex attraction in the leadership of the church played on their position on question of same-sex relationship and question of non-conforming gender identity. And then a month after that, which was March 10th, which now feels like it was a century ago, but which was only a month ago, we had welcomed Matthew Shurka, who is an activist that works on issues of conversion therapy, and he's part of the Born Perfect project. And so he talked to us about the effort to push back on conversion therapy in many states in the United States and abroad. And today we're really lucky to welcome Sean Strub to talk about HIV criminalization, and also to some extent about the link between HIV criminalization and emerging COVID-19 criminalization and how it compares. So I'm particularly happy to have this conversation with Sean today because it's not only about COVID-19. And it's a reminder that even though the entire world is focusing on the pandemic for very good reasons, the challenge that our community has on a day-to-day basis are still existing. And that in many ways, sometimes those challenges are being exacerbated by the pandemic. And that we have to be careful not to deprioritize some of the issues we've been pushing for a long time. So I'll give a very quick introduction to Sean. Sean has many different lives, so it's difficult to kind of summarize it. First of all, he's a businessman, which is particularly great because a lot of our audience today are business people. But then Sean is also an LGBTI activist, and particularly an HIV activist that has been on the global scene championing the rights of people living with HIV, but also in the United States has been a true champion on those issues. And I think where your business profile met your activism profile is that you founded Pause magazine, which then mushroomed into other magazines in the same time. And then you're also the mayor of a city, the mayor of Milford, Pennsylvania, which is very close by. And you've actually showed tremendous leadership in responding to COVID-19 for your constituents, but also for the entire county and to some extent the state. And maybe you will have an opportunity to talk about that. So that also leads me to thank you so much, Sean, for taking the time, because I know that this is also a time of crisis for your community, and that you have a lot of different priorities. So we are very grateful for you taking the time to speak to us. So what I think is that we are going to have this conversation for the next 40 to 45 minutes, and then we will have 15 minutes for Q&A, and then we will close it, at noon, so people can enjoy their Good Friday, despite the confinement. So Sean, my first question to you on HIV criminalization will be whether you can give us a bit of an overview of what the issue is. And the reason I ask you that is that very often when you talk to people in the community, they are still baffled when you tell them that you can be criminalized for your HIV status and for transmitting HIV. So I would love if you could give us a little bit of an overview, and also if you could tell us if things are getting better or if they are getting worse when it comes to HIV criminalization.
Sure. Thank you, Fabrice. And I'm very pleased you invited me to do this today. HIV criminalization, just to start with a definition. And I should mention that really my role here today is as executive director of the Sero Project, which is a network of people living with HIV, combating HIV criminalization and doing other things. But
another of your many hats.
HIV criminalization is the inappropriate or wrongful use of a person's HIV status in a criminal prosecution or sometimes in a regulatory process. It is probably most people are familiar with it in terms of criminalizing a person with HIV's failure to be able to prove they had disclosed their HIV status before being intimate with someone else. But then there also are many cases where people with HIV are prosecuted for being accused of spitting or biting or scratching. There are many states with penalty enhancements for certain types of crimes, prostitution in particular, where if you're charged with a crime and then they find out you also have HIV, it's bumped up to a more serious crime. So about 2/3 of the states have HIV specific statutes, meaning laws that single out HIV, that create this sort of viral underclass in the law, which, you know, most people think that the law should apply to everyone the same, that we should not have different laws for different parts of society based on the color of their skin or their gender or their sexual orientation or their physical ability or disabilities or their genetic makeup. But here we are creating different laws based on a virus they carry, and we're now starting to see this with COVID as well. But in every state, and this is a global phenomenon, which I'll get to in a moment, but in every state, whether they have an HIV specific law or not, prosecutors will heighten charges, regular charges for assault or whatever it is. And we've seen circumstances where people have been charged with under a terrorism statute or under other kinds of things for, you know, wildly disproportionate to what they're accused of. And well, the most of these cases, and I would say the vast majority, you know, a few years ago, Sero filed several thousand right to know and, you know, Freedom of Information Act type FOIA requests with prosecutors all around the country. And we identified 1,600 instances when charges were filed under HIV specific statutes. And the number of times that involved HIV transmission was way less than 5%. So it's not about HIV transmission. It's about the perceived or potential exposure and or transmission of HIV. So this is where, you know, you get some of these cases that have gotten a lot of attention that are, you know, in just egregious instances of injustice. You know, where a member of our board of directors, the Sero Project, Carrie Thomas, had been a person who was public about his HIV status as a volunteer with a local agency, and he'd been in the paper actually on a previous criminal charge, identified as a person with HIV. And the woman he was dating accused him of not disclosing to him. And there was no transmission of HIV. She said he insisted on using condoms. His medical records show he was undetectable throughout the relationship. And as we, you know, sit here today in front of our screens on Good Friday, Carrie is about 10 years into a 30-year sentence in Idaho, where he's incarcerated. Again, no transmission, no risk of transmission. You know, there are other cases that
the plaintiff is not HIV positive.
No, she's not. No. And there are many of these cases, you know, like this. You know, many people know the case of Michael Johnson. Stephen Thrasher wrote about and really brought to attention a case in Missouri. And I believe he was initially sentenced to 60 years. And subsequently on appeal was got out. In Iowa, where I am from, there was a statute that was a mandatory 25-year sentence if someone was convicted under that statute. And about 2% of the people with HIV in the state had been prosecuted. We only found HIV transmission in one of those cases. And some of them were just horrific circumstances. I mean, there was a woman in Sioux City who was a housekeeper in a motel, and she met a man in her Bible study group, and they began dating, and he moved in with her. And she says he always knew she was positive. He went to the pharmacy to get her meds at times. But they had a fight, became contentious. He had addiction issues. She kicked him out of her house. And he went to the county prosecutor and said she didn't tell him she was positive, and he wanted to arrest her. So she was arrested and convicted, and got lifetime sex offender registration. And this is, so there are these cases all over the country that are really, really, really horrific. And the problem with this, in addition to the injustice, and in many ways this is a reflection of a criminal justice system in the US that is anchored in white supremacy and that has disproportionately criminalizes Black and brown bodies and immigrants and sex workers and people who use drugs and LGBT people, in many cases young people. But it also is horrific public health policy. And that concern is, I think, what has finally given more energy to the effort to address HIV criminalization. Because for one, a person generally can't be prosecuted if they don't know they have HIV. So it becomes a disincentive to get tested. I know attorneys who have advised people, if they're otherwise feeling healthy, for them not to get tested and take on this potential criminal liability with the knowledge of their HIV status. Well, this isn't what we want. We want people to know their HIV status. But when a person is feeling well and they hear about these cases, and very often the cases boil down to he said, she said, he said, why should they take on that chance? Particularly if there's someone from a community that has had a history of good reason to distrust the criminal justice system or distrust the public health system. So sometimes you hear take the test and risk arrest. So that is one really horrific problem with criminalization and the public health consequences. Then is also an issue that it erodes the trust between the person with HIV and public health services. There's a very good study in Canada that showed that where the person with HIV knew they were in a state or a province or a jurisdiction that prosecuted people for this, they were far less likely to cooperate with traditional public health interventions, such as partner notification or treatment adherence compliance programs. There's been other research. It's sort of dated now because it's kind of pre-prep, but there was a study at the University of Minnesota that showed that gay men who knew there was an HIV criminalization statute in their state, they were more likely to engage in unprotected anal intercourse. So there are all sorts of terrible public health ramifications of this, including just the stigma of it. Just branding people with HIV a criminal for this, for the status, for things that that for other people would not constitute a crime or not constitute as serious of a crime. This drives stigma. The prosecutions are often involved. There's one public health department in Southeast Missouri, in Todd Mangum's case. They got together with their sheriff and created a poster. It looked like an old-fashioned, wanted poster from the Wild West. Have you had sexual contact with this man? And in their public release, they said he had potentially, he may have infected 300 people. Now, how they got that number was they extrapolated. He said, "How often do you have sex?" And he said, "About once a week." And they extrapolated the number of weeks from the time when he tested positive, even though he'd been on treatment part of the time. It just is, has nothing to do with the behaviors they engaged in or anything like that. So you get this hysterical media coverage, often driven by the criminal justice system or the public health system, actors in that, that then create greater stigma. In Texas, there was a case of a woman who was killed by her boyfriend after she disclosed her HIV status to him. And when the cops arrived, he said, she was killing me, so I killed her. There have actually been several cases of women getting killed by partners after disclosure. And, that's obviously horrific. Now, on the other hand, this person who killed her got possibly no HIV education in school whatsoever. And he lives in a state that put a man in prison for 35 years for spitting at someone. Now, if he sees that the state is incarcerating someone for 35 years for spitting, well, it's not an excuse obviously for harming this woman, killing her, but it is some understanding of why he might have been that much more frightened, that much more panicked, that much more concerned when he found out that his partner had HIV positive. So, the stigma has a huge effect on people's behavior. So that's kind of an overview in the US.
Yeah.
This is also a global phenomenon. And sadly, the US has been one of the leaders in prosecutions around the world. And in fact, in some cases, we actually prompted passage of these statutes. A few years ago, the American Foreign Aid Agency sponsored a conference for parliamentarians across countries in Africa. And one of the things that came out of that conference was supposedly a model HIV criminalization statute. So a whole bunch of countries then went and passed that, which were, now they're activists working to pull them back. So the U.S. has been a really insidious influence on this and been one of the ones driving it globally. The HIV Justice Network, which is Edwin Bernard's sort of global clearinghouse for all sorts of information about criminalization, has maps and a lot of detail country by country. And that's hivjustice.net.
So I had a question for you, which is, you kind of referred to the fact that it's part of a wider trend of criminalizing brown bodies and criminalizing sex work. But do you think that the entire explanation of the reason why HIV is criminalized compared to other diseases that are not? Why HIV is my question. Why do you think that HIV is a disease that has the most effort to criminalize?
Right. It's because of who's identified with getting it. Initially, in particular, gay men, but then increasingly, as the epidemic sort of settled into communities of people living in poverty and communities of color, particularly African Americans in the American South, it is another way. It in some ways becomes a marker for racism or homophobia or sexism. When it can't be as overt about things, around those characteristics. Here, there's a new way to slice and dice society and hold part of it down. And it isn't just HIV. There are statutes relating to hepatitis. In some cases, globally, people with tuberculosis have been criminalized. And of course, we're seeing this now with COVID. This is part of a broader trend of it's like a change in how we view public health. It used to be that public health was, if there was a health problem, that's what we needed to go out and fix. That's what we needed to address collectively as a society. Now it's almost like disease has been securitized and it's processed through a financial calculation, economic calculation, and a political calculation. How important is this constituency to have a commensurate response to it? And this is, I think, something very dangerous. And HIV has sort of been in the forefront of it.
Oh, so, I mean, even though I promised that I would not make all of this about COVID-19, what you just said kind of reminded me of that comment from the lieutenant governor of Texas that said, older people should be ready to die more or less, I'm paraphrasing, right, in order to secure the economy. So do you see a parallel between this idea that COVID-19 is mostly affecting older people and that, this is maybe something that we are really ready to lose in order to protect the economy, and what you described as public health being seen through the prism of economic and political power?
So, early in the epidemic, when you mentioned President Reagan and his failure to even mention the word AIDS, I think until well into his second term, there have been notes released from meetings of his domestic policy council and so on. We find people like Gary Bauer, who was his domestic policy advisor, and I'm paraphrasing, but saying things like, let nature take its course. This was not just a neglect or an indifference or a lack of awareness of what was happening. It was by design, because it was seen that the people who were getting it were not a priority for society. They were disposable. This was really about those people. And I think it's certainly a factor at play with COVID, but COVID, more of the sort of pushback around it and the poor policies is really just about greed. It's about, let's not shut down these businesses to save lives. Let's not slow down the economy and deal with those consequences, which are obviously going to be severe. It's not prioritizing the lives of people. It's prioritizing profits. And we're seeing this in more grotesque and blatant ways in recent years.
So to go back to the overview that you gave us on HIV criminalization, you've been part of global network and national network that are fighting HIV criminalization and that are actually making that argument. One argument that you really explained to us is that it actually gets in the way of what we want to achieve, which is a healthcare response to HIV. If people do not want to get tested, if people start fearing health professionals and the justice system, we actually are not making the progress we should make in the epidemic. So would you say that you've been successful in your efforts, first of all, to fight HIV criminalization? Is it getting better or is it getting worse? And then second of all, do you find that the LGBT community, which has been tremendously affected, even though a lot of the examples you gave us are actually examples of straight people that have been affected by this criminalization, we know that a lot of people that are living with HIV today are people that are part of the LGBT community, so we should be engaged. Do you think that the community is sufficiently engaged in that fight? And then the third aspect, which might be interesting to our audience and the people that will watch the replay of our conversation, is do you feel that the private sector has a role to play in supporting your efforts to fight HIV criminalization? And how would you formulate the argument for them to get engaged in it?
Sure. So in terms of progress, yes, in some ways we've made progress. We've certainly brought the issue to the forefront. Sero and other groups that have been working on this issue for years, Positive Women's Network, Lambda Legal Defense, Center for HIV Law and Policy in the US, the Canadian HIV/AIDS Rights Alliance has really been leading this in Canada, the AIDS Rights Alliance of Southern Africa, ARASA. So yes, we have sort of made this an issue that people are aware of. I think we've been successful at helping to connect the dots between what repression and oppressive and unjust criminal acts in the criminal justice system, how that relates to poor public health outcomes. So there is much greater awareness, including global NGOs at the UNAIDS and WHO and other places. Domestically in the US, we have seen reform of some of the state statutes to varying degrees, but Iowa and Colorado and California and Michigan and Washington, and through a regulatory process in North Carolina. These are states that have changed their statutes, but changing the statutes doesn't change the bias that leads to this. So in terms of prosecutions, that's a good question. It's a little tough to tell whether prosecutions are declining or not. I think they might be declining somewhat in the US over a few years ago. I'm not sure of that. Globally, as Sero Project is part of HIV Justice Worldwide, which is a network of a number of human rights organizations around the world who coordinate our work globally. And we're getting more and more data from countries where we're finding places where there are prosecutions where we didn't know there were prosecutions before. So whether it's still growing or not globally remains to be seen. Domestically, if it's growing in terms of prosecutions, I don't think it's dramatic growth. And I know we have been very successful at stopping new statutes that have been introduced. New legislation's been introduced in a number of states, Rhode Island, Alabama, and Maryland, some other states, Arizona, where they did not have an HIV-specific criminal statute, and some legislator thought that would be a good idea, and we've been able to stop those. So yes, there's definitely progress. The second part of your question was the LGBT community's engagement in this.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Do you feel that the community is sufficiently aware of the issue, of how much of a stake we have in it, and do you feel that you get the support from the LGBT community? You should get, given the extent in which we are affected by the issue.
Right. So, I mean, that operates on various levels, right? In a macro sense, the LGBT community has largely left the HIV epidemic, right? For marriage equality battles and military service, and gone on to other things. There was a time when someone was diagnosed in the U.S. and there was this loving, embracing LGBT community and HIV community that would wrap its arms around the person and said, "We will get through this together." A community that accepted this epidemic as a collective responsibility. And I don't think that's there sort of, across the board in the way that it once was. On the other hand, a number of state equality organizations, particularly those who had, when we were first starting Sero, who had already achieved marriage equality in their state, right? They had built up a lot of capacity to fight for marriage equality, and they had available bandwidth. So then a number of them got engaged in HIV criminalization work. So that has been good. Certainly with Sero, we are funded in part by a number of people and organizations who fund LGBT efforts as well. But what I think that maybe is not so well understood is, first of all, how fragile the gains that we as an LGBT community have made over the last 40, 50 years, how fragile these gains are, and how quickly they can go away. And in some ways, things like HIV criminalization are a harbinger. We're out at the edge. And when we're losing, that's getting closer and closer to more fundamental rights around sexual expression are at risk. So I'm not sure that connection is fully there. I think there are a lot of people engaged in LGBT work who see it in a very narrow silo in the context of their own lives. Just coming out is a function of privilege to start with. So there is work to be done to connect the LGBT advocacy movement, which has grown and is so massive, beyond anybody's imagination. When I got involved in this work, in the late 70s, it certainly has far exceeded that. But we need more of that to also understand how LGBT rights are intrinsically linked to issues of race and gender and poverty.
Great. And so the next part of my question was, as a businessman, do you see that the private sector could play a role on this issue? And we have a network. Out Leadership is a network, the largest coalition of private companies pushing for LGBTI equality. And then besides that, we have a gigantic network of private companies that are engaged through the various platforms of out leadership. Do you think that they could play a role in supporting efforts to fight HIV criminalization?
Sure. One, I'll start with pointing out the role that businesses played in making HIV criminalization much worse. When we were working, I don't know, 10 or whatever it was, in Iowa to change that statute, we discovered that the statute in Illinois was almost identical, word for word, just a couple of minor changes. And we thought that was odd because we didn't think that the legislators in Des Moines, the capital of Iowa, and the legislators in Springfield, the capital of Illinois, were like comparing notes. And a journalist and researcher in Michigan, Todd Haywood, dug into this. And what he discovered was that ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, which is a consortium of big businesses, insurance companies, banks, pharmaceutical companies, manufacturers, that funds the creation of model statutes. They're kind of shadowy. They're not generally known to the public. It's called ALEC. I'm sure some of the people on the call are familiar with it. They create model statutes, and then they go in through legislatures and try and get these statutes passed. So ALEC was an organization behind the passage of many of these statutes, these HIV criminalization statutes. So the first thing I would say is that business enterprises need to make sure they're not doing any harm. And they need to look at their trade associations, the think tanks, the places they fund. Look more broadly than maybe what you think directly involves your company or your commercial interests. Look at what they are funding, what they are doing overall, and make sure you are not supporting things that are inflicting harm. Beyond that, it's certainly the obvious things. You want to model the kind of behavior of equality, educating your employees, leveraging your relationships to bring attention to these issues and to bring greater justice. And again, this is not narrow to HIV or to LGBT. This is a broader struggle for really fundamental rights for many, many sectors in society around the world. And I think we need more corporate leaders who see that in an integrated, broad way and want to be known as social justice warriors as well as successful companies.
Thanks a lot, Sean. And I love what you say, which is that the first principle is do not harm. That companies should make sure that they are not indirectly contributing to creating a problem. And so I find that this is fascinating. Something that I found very interesting is that you come back very often to the issue that there is an intersectionality between HIV criminalization, and poverty, and race, and marginalization. And actually, yesterday on Out Leadership Insights, we wrote a piece about the fact that COVID-19 is not the great equalizer that it was described to be. Governor Cuomo, Madonna used the term great equalizer, and now statistics are coming out showing that the poor are disproportionately affected. There's a lot of statistics in Chicago that are really alarming, but also in many other states, including Missouri, that show that the poorest, the ethnic minorities are affected. And it's difficult to know why. One obvious response that we identify is that the public response has not been catered to the people that were the most at risk. And then the other aspect is that there is a huge vulnerability for marginalized population that might not have access to health services, that might be hesitant to go to the hospital for financial reasons, and that also have not gotten the message of how to protect themselves, and have not getting there. So something that you kind of alluded to is that the LGBT community has lost, to some extent, interest in the HIV epidemic when it started affecting more disproportionately the most marginalized segment of the population and less the elite, meaning, frankly, white gay men, and particularly upper and middle class white gay men. So First of all, as an American, do you think that's inevitable? Do you think it is inevitable that the health response is motivated by how much it affects people that have power, people that have clout, people that can influence political decision? And second of all, do you see a parallel between the way HIV is now disproportionately affecting, the most marginalized, and the response is kind of forgotten, and what's happening now with COVID-19?
Yeah. So, I think that I've often talked about, one kind of macro way to look at the AIDS epidemic and its effect on men who have sex with men and gay men is it's a consequence of the oppression. You cannot take a part of society and abuse it and treat it so poorly for so long without having a public health consequence. We pay for that discrimination and violence and abuse and limited opportunity, all those things. We ultimately pay for it in public health. And that is the same for every marginalized community. And we're seeing that in COVID now. It is many of the communities who have the least access to justice, who are subject to profound health disparities, who even things like social distancing. If you're living 6 people in a 2-room apartment, how do you social distance? If you're homeless, how do you social? There are all these things that we need to start with how we protect those people who are furthest from protection, rather than starting with protecting those who have the most, who are closest to protection.
Well, that's very interesting, and so my next question, which is kind of not related to what we've been discussing, but do you think that there is going to be a lesson learned from COVID-19 that might actually apply to HIV on our health system, and also the way we look at the most vulnerable population in our health response? Or do you think that this is going to remain unchanged by the current pandemic?
No, I don't think it'll remain unchanged, but I don't think we're going to see dramatic change soon. But I do see that there is, over the arc of history and time, there are more people who are making the connection between how we marginalize parts of society and how ultimately the overall society flourishes or not. Domestically, I think there's a good chance that that COVID-19 the epidemic will create the kind of support for investment in our public health system that we need, and possibly for getting to the point where we have health care for every American. That would be a huge, huge, huge step. It's absurd that it has taken so long, and it's awful that it is going to take so much suffering. But I think that's potentially a positive outcome from this. But I think there's also, in a really broad way, to understand that, what we do to the earth, what we do to each other, it comes back to us in public health catastrophes or another way. And that we all need to get enlightened to a sort of new plane. And maybe this takes us a step there towards that, we can hope.
Thanks a lot, Sean. So a question I had that came up a lot on Facebook and on social media in the past few days, particularly in the LGBT community, is that question of the blood ban, meaning that restrict gay men from giving blood because they are believed to be at a higher risk of living with HIV. And what is your take on the current controversy? And also, I would be interested if you think that, again, the private sector has a role to play in fighting a blood ban that a lot of people believe is not justified.
Right. Did I see the other day that they've modified it now? So
yeah,
yeah,
temporarily respond.
so as the
Okay.
need for blood becomes greater, I guess we more gay men are going to be acceptable for it. I mean, it's ridiculous. The science doesn't support it. There are ways to protect the blood supply, and it just is a vestige of the kind of stigma associated with AIDS and discrimination that gay men and others have faced. Do I think that will change eventually? Yes, I think it probably will. It may take a different administration in the White House for that to happen fully.
And do you think that the blood ban is contributing to this stigma, to the stigma around HIV that you've been describing, and that is actually also fueling HIV criminalization? And besides the blood ban, do you see other ways in which prejudice and stigma against HIV, against people living with HIV, are being reinforced? And one of the questions that I would love, that I have for you as someone who is openly living with HIV is: do you believe that the prejudice and the stigma against people living with HIV is worsening, or do you think it has been the same in the past few years?
Well, that and my answer to that may surprise many people in here, but I've lived with HIV my entire adult life. Looking at my medical records, we think I acquired it in 1980. And at one time, 25 years ago or so, I was very sick. I weighed 45 pounds less than I weigh now. My face was covered with Kaposi sarcoma lesions. My CD4 count measured my immune system was 1, and my viral load was in the millions. And when I would walk down the street in the village, I was accustomed to dogs barking and little kids pointing and mothers pulling their children close to them. So, I mean, I have some concept of what that kind of stigma is about. But I feel HIV-related stigma more today than ever. And I think that many long-term survivors would say that. And the reasons for it are several. One is that the perception of people with HIV, the popular perception, has changed. In the early years of the epidemic, we were seen as expected to die, right? There were people with AIDS. And regardless of whatever moral or religious concerns someone might have about homosexuality or drug use or sex work or whatever, we were still seen through that prism of we were going to die, and there was some degree of human sympathy and compassion for us. Because we were thought we were going to die, possibly a really horrific death, and probably very soon. When effective therapy came out in the mid-90s, and it slowly began to seep into the broader consciousness that people with HIV were not dying, but they were going to be around and living longer, we started to become defined by the criminal justice system and the public health system, and to a large extent by the media, not through the prism of our likely death, but through the prism of our survival. And if we were living longer, we would be around longer to potentially infect others. So we started to become designated as an inherently dangerous population, a threat to society that needed to be tracked down and identified and tested and reported and listed and regulated and controlled. That's when all the names reporting bills that we had successfully resisted for years were passed. And, where once, there was a steady flow of coverage in the media of the person with HIV, the mom with HIV who's, holding down a job and raising 3 kids despite dealing with this life-threatening health condition. The triumph of the human spirit, kind of inspiring, uplifting stories about people with HIV and how they were coping with this. Those have largely gone away. And today, when a person with HIV is mentioned by name in the media, more often than not, it's in the context of a criminal prosecution. Frequently, it was phrases like, HIV predator and serial infector and AIDS monster and this sort of thing. And so this influences how people perceive people with HIV. And there are other factors as well. There was for many years in the U.S. And to a large extent around the world, there were very strong networks of people with HIV. When a person was diagnosed, the most important thing to be done was to connect them with other people with HIV, whether in a support group or a network or Body Positive or People with AIDS Coalition. These were all over the country, these groups, and some were formal, some were informal. And that is where people with HIV built community. It's where we asked questions and learned how to cope with this, tremendous challenge in our lives. There was, I guess, a belief that we were going to treat our way out of the epidemic or something. And the funding and support for those kinds of efforts to enable people with HIV to convene and work with each other, to speak with collective voices, to choose and hold accountable leadership that we choose rather than having somebody choose our leaders for us, and to develop our own agenda and priorities. That kind of faded to the back. And today, most service providers don't provide any support groups, or far fewer than they ever did. There is little funding for these networks at a local level compared to what there once was. So a diagnosis today is much lonelier. And when someone is diagnosed today, in that little cubicle, when they're getting this life-changing news, they are seldom given an opportunity to connect with other people with HIV. The priority isn't to get them with other people with HIV, it's to get them on treatment so they can't pose a risk to other people. They aren't posing a risk of transmitting the virus. I think this has contributed to stigma. We don't have these sort of support structures that were so important in other parts of the epidemic. And in much of the world, they still are very, very important.
There's a question that appears on the screen that kind of relates to that, which is, you describe the fact that public funding and private funding has disappeared in many ways as the compassion and the empathy has gone down. So one of the questions that came up on the screen is do you have examples of private companies that you believe are doing right toward their employee living with HIV? And what kind of policies and practice companies can put in place to be supportive of their employees living with HIV, showing that they understand that they do exist and that they understand also that they have a duty to be supportive and to show the empathy that should come from them.
Sure. In the early 90s, I co-authored a book called Cracking the Corporate Closet, where we looked at various companies and some of the things they were doing around the epidemic. And I can't say that either that specific companies jump to mind for me. I'm sure there are many that are far better than others. There is not a nonprofit effort that I know of that works specifically with the private sector looking at these things. Sorry, that's my dog barking in the background. Must be the mailman. So I can't point to examples, but I'm sure they're there. In terms of the kinds of things that companies can do, one of the Alfie. Sorry.
No, are you kidding? It's in the COVID-19 time, there is nothing more normal than having children and dogs being part of the world.
That's true.
And, at Out Leadership, we have a dog, the dog of Todd Sears, that do participate in a lot of our webinars. So Alfie is more than welcome to weigh in the conversation.
I might bring him over here in a minute. But the kinds of things. One of the big reasons, right? So people say, why don't people just disclose, right? Disclosure is dangerous. Disclosure is something that is risky, and the consequences are greater today than they were years ago. Years ago, people were more concerned about living until next spring than worrying about who knew they had HIV. There was an expectation they would lose weight, they would get KS, people around them would know they had it or suspect they had it. So there wasn't as much anxiety about disclosing. I truly don't remember who I first disclosed to or when. It wasn't any kind of drama. you weren't worrying about the long-term effect on your career. But today, that's very different. So, there are really serious consequences to disclosing. One is the risk of partner violence. I mentioned the women who have been killed. Well, this is not uncommon, violence or losing one's housing. This happens frequently. Risking custody of one's children. And certainly career. When I speak to, sort of professional gay men I know with HIV who are, keep that a secret. And one in particular who provides funding to Sero. And they really believe they cannot because it will affect their career path. And I think he's right. I think he is right. This is the kind of thing, that probably in some circumstances, but maybe not as much as once was, that women would not get promoted because they might get married and go get pregnant. Don't promote the guy with HIV. He might not be here as long or whatever. Or that there's an icky factor. So I think those things are real. There's not a lot that measures that. We do have a global HIV stigma index, which is a fantastic tool that looks at some discriminatory things and the experiences of people with HIV. But in terms of what companies can do is, put in place the practices that protect people with all kinds of health conditions at their companies and really make them real. Translate them beyond the language to real practice. In the early 80s, before my life got hijacked by the epidemic, I was very involved in the corporate social responsibility movement because I really believe in the power of the private sector to influence things like this. And I co-authored a book called Rating America's Corporate Conscience. And at the time, we called up major companies and manufacturers of consumer goods. And we wanted to speak to somebody about corporate social responsibility. Well, most of them didn't even know what that phrase meant. But the ones that did, we found there was almost a relationship between having that phrase somewhere in their corporate materials and being at the poor end of corporate social responsibility. They knew to get the language in there, but not to translate it into practice. And certainly getting the language there is a start, but it isn't very meaningful if you don't provide the resources in your HR department to do the training, the monitoring, to make sure that your company isn't one that is perpetuating these kinds of things. And of course, there are obvious things like support for the organizations that do that. I don't know of any corporations that support the networks of people living with HIV in the US. There are 5 or 6 national networks: Positive Women's Network USA, the Sero Project, which I run, Positively Trans, which is part of the Transgender Law Center, which I believe does have some corporate support, Thrive SS, the Reunion Project, Latinx Plus. These are networks that people with HIV have formed themselves. And they're typically minimally funded and are in various stages of growth. And it'd be great to see corporations willing to step into that space.
And pharmaceutical companies are not being supportive?
Pharmaceutical companies are an exception to that, I should say. And that's its own, tricky
imagine
slippery slope, right? Gilead is usually in the top 2 or 3 list of the Chronicle Philanthropy's largest contributors of cash to charitable organizations, typically between $400 and $500 million a year. Almost every HIV organization in the country gets grants from Gilead, including Sero Project, which I run. Now, what that does, you can have people who are convinced of their own integrity in organizations that, we won't let that influence, our policies. But that becomes tougher, when you become addicted to that funding. And it becomes very easy, when there's the opportunity to speak out on something that's a problem that a company is doing that's funding you, you don't take that call from that reporter, or maybe you focus on something else. One example I use of how this kind of corporate funding can influence the community's policy priorities is the AIDS drug assistance programs. People with HIV in every state in the country get many of them, if not most of them, access HIV drugs through their state's AIDS drug assistance program, which is funded by Congress. And every year there is a nonprofit organization that works to get this funding renewed every year, which is critically important. Without it, many people would be in very difficult shape. And they have funding to bring people with HIV from around the country to Washington to go and meet with their members of Congress and say, hey, we need this, you need to support this, right? And that effort is paid for by the pharmaceutical companies, right? Now, on the other hand, if we wanted to bring those people to Washington to instead fight for price controls or fight for the government to have more latitude in negotiating with the drug companies or for manufacture of generics or for other things, that would be a very lonely battle. There's nobody funding that, So sometimes the funding is there to, divert. Now, one of the things that brought corporate funding to the HIV criminalization effort, and I say this at the same time while knowing all sorts of people in pharmaceutical companies and in philanthropy from pharmaceuticals who are as genuine and sincere and doing the very, very best they can within that context. But one of the reasons that the pharmaceutical industry is increasingly become supportive of our efforts to end HIV criminalization is because it is a disincentive to people getting tested.
Yeah.
People don't get tested, they don't get that customer, basically. So they want to remove impediments.
Pharmaceutical companies are supportive of your efforts. Pharmaceutical companies are supportive of your efforts to fight HIV criminality.
Yes. And very agree.
The good side of the coin. Yeah. So we are coming toward the end of our webinar, and you have constituents that are facing a pandemic. So I assume you have probably many things to do today. You mentioned that your life, that will be my last question. You mentioned that your life was hijacked by the epidemic, and actually I have here your amazing book, Body Counts, which your life might have been hijacked, but it made for a wonderful, meaningful life, and in many ways, many lives, because you have led many lives. So you find yourself in the center of another epidemic, which is COVID-19. You now are going beyond serving, your city and your county. You're looking at what's happening in the state of Pennsylvania. You have lost many friends to the HIV epidemic, and the HIV epidemic, as you said, kind of marked your life. Is that new pandemic triggering, what is your reaction to it? I mean, from an emotional point of view, is it bringing you back to the time of the 80s and the 90s? Do you find similarities? And how are you coping personally with being at the center of another epidemic that is also affecting our community?
It is not triggering that. There are certainly things that are reminiscent of various aspects of the epidemic, including the anxiety and the worry about friends. I have a number of friends who are elderly and some with health conditions, and I really worry about them a lot. My father's 88 years old, and he flew today from Florida to Iowa, and I'm just like, in the world I've been working in, the crisis hasn't stopped, either in terms of the epidemic or in terms of the various injustices. That is, there are people who have been living in that kind of terror and crisis consistently over the decades. And so in that sense, no, it's not triggering. But what I do think is interesting is the number of people who are veterans of the AIDS epidemic who have become kind of organically arisen as leaders in the response to COVID. I'm the mayor of this little town in Pennsylvania, and we advised our businesses to shut down and our residents to stay in their homes on March 12th, which is very early. I think we were the first governmental subdivision in Pennsylvania to do so, against a lot of resistance and criticism at the time. And that is only because of my own experience with an epidemic and familiarity with epidemiologists and sort of, information sources. And, I was paying attention closer to it. And I also, had personal experience of what governmental neglect and inaction can result in, and how it costs lives. So at every level, you sort of generously referred to Milford as a city. We're really a village. We're a little teeny tiny place.
A beautiful one, but a beautiful one.
A good one, right? Atlantic Magazine called it the prettiest county seat in America. But the leadership, people who've had this familiarity with the epidemic are much more likely to be kind of out front and helping to educate and engage their neighbors. And in my case, because I'm so well known as an AIDS activist and a person living, with HIV, excuse me, I think that also gave me credibility with some of the community stewards, some of the people in our community and county who might have otherwise been, wait a minute, is this really necessary? What do you mean wear masks? What do you mean, social distance? Shutting down businesses? Are you for real? That I think it helped some of them give it a little second look and look a little deeper and realize that we were really doing a progressive thing, that we were in the vanguard, and that I hope will ultimately show that maybe the epidemic isn't had as much effect here.
Well, Sean, I cannot thank you enough. I have to say that, you exemplify to me how you managed to make from a traumatic experience a meaningful life, and your fight is inspiring. And hopefully that's what as a community we can do. The experience of COVID-19, as you mentioned, might be an opportunity to look at the way we treat our most marginalized population, and what is the impact of not supporting this population, ultimately. So I thank you so much for taking the time to join Out Leadership this morning. I'm going to take a minute to thank again our sponsors, HSBC, Robson Gray, RBC Capital Markets, EY, and KPMG. And I wish you a good Easter weekend despite the confinement. And I hope we talk to you again soon, Sean. Thank you again for joining us.
It's been an honor. Thank you.